Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story. Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, our story follows Frank Bompensiero, a man whose name carried quiet weight along the California coast, known for his patience, discipline, and sharp instincts. Before we begin, like this video. We're aiming for 100 likes in this video. Share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support motivates us to bring you even more fascinating stories from the underworld. Settle in and let the story of Frank Bompensiero guide you into the night. He was born in 1905, a child of Sicilian immigrants who came to the Midwest seeking steady work and a place to build a future. English arrived on his tongue with practice, Italian lived in the house, and the habits of old country caution shaped the home. The family reached California while he was still young, joining many who followed the rail lines and promises of clean air and growth. San Diego felt like a small town in those years, a Navy city by a border, a place where goods and people moved and rules could bend if you knew which doors to knock on. He grew into a compact man with a calm stare. He listened, learned, and kept quiet. That quiet would become his armor. The 1,920 seconds brought prohibition and the sudden hunger for liquor that flowed from Mexico and the sea into speakeasies and private halls. San Diego's piers, roads, and canyons gave cover to those who moved cases by night, and a young man with steady nerves could find work running errands. He did what reliable men did then: carry messages, watch shipments, stand near doors when cash changed hands, and make sure bills were counted. He learned how a whisper can be stronger than a shout, how a favor needs repayment, and how risk lives in small mistakes. By the time national prohibition fell, the habits had settled, and men who liked how he worked kept him close. In Los Angeles, Jack Dragna built a regional organization that took shape as a local crime family with deep roots in the Italian community. It was not the biggest outfit in the country, yet it was disciplined and careful. Los Angeles had its own politics, and those politics reached south. Frank earned a place in that circle and became a trusted hand. He did not chase the spotlight that dazzled some figures who courted Hollywood press or rag paper headlines. Instead, he gravitated to the work of collections, protection of gambling operations, and the simple but dangerous task of telling people that a line had been drawn. If someone crossed it, he would make the next visit. That kind of work built a reputation without a billboard. By the 1,930 seconds and 1,940 seconds, horse racing, bookmaking, and card rooms generated real money along the coast. The business depended on a flow of information about race results and odds, and it depended even more on fear. There were times when a bookmaker fell behind, a cafe owner resisted a demand for a cut, or a courier tried to skim. Those were the days when Frank's voice carried weight. He was regularly tailed by local detectives who kept thick notebooks on his movements. Arrests came in flurries. Suspicion of assault, suspicion of extortion, suspicion of conspiracy to threaten. Charges often fizzled. Witnesses withdrew. Tips went cold. He got used to being photographed at a curb and then walking away while the camera clicked. But not every case fell apart. He would be convicted more than once for offenses tied to extortion and threats, serving time in federal custody in the middle years of his career. Those convictions were not gossip. They came from indictments, trials, and judges who signed commitment papers. The pattern was set. A hard man, not a loud one, who protected rackets, collected debts, and kept a tight circle of trusted contacts. San Diego became his base. He helped oversee local bookmaking and loan shark activity that backed bettors and small businesses at high interest, a stream of cash that paid only if borrowers stayed scared. He invested in neighborhood taverns and cafes, which served as meeting spots and fronts. The lights stayed low, the jukebox played, and the back tables stayed busy with whispers. This was not cinema. It was routine. Payments were scheduled, favors were exchanged, and when a patron stepped out of line, someone explained the rules again. To those hit by those schemes, the rules never felt like rules. They felt like a squeeze. To men like Frank, those rules were the working code. His approach lacked the swagger seen in some other American cities. He wore simple clothes, kept his hair short, and avoided loud venues. He drove himself, watched for tails, and used public phones instead of home lines whenever he could. He taught younger associates to let others talk and to store names and numbers in memory. Those habits fed his survival. Law enforcement respected his patience. Reporters tried to get quotes and got a blank stare or a shake of the head. Yet paper records piled up. Phone toll sheets with clusters of calls to known gamblers, surveillance logs describing meetings in diners and parking lots, and notes from confidential sources who cited his name when they described late-night sessions where debts were carved up and territory divided. The Los Angeles organization leaned on him to stabilize San Diego after campus raids and vice crackdowns. When Los Angeles police disrupted one cluster of bookmakers, another cluster reopened. Federal pressure rose during World War II and after, especially in cases tied to interstate transport of bets and messaging. He adapted. He kept travel tight, used go-betweens, and gave instructions in short, plain phrases that could be denied if repeated. He never bragged on paper. He never wrote anything that had to be burned. That self-control kept him out of deep prison terms during the earlier years, though he did serve real time later, enough to remind him that a cell door never slams softly. One constant in his life was the presence of rival crews and independent operators in Southern California. The region had Hollywood showmen, Jewish racketeers, and independents who liked to try their luck without paying tribute. Los Angeles newspapers loved those louder figures. They rarely loved Frank because he refused to feed them lines. Police and FBI files tied him to episodes where outsiders were warned off or punished for refusing a demand. In those accounts, he was often labeled an enforcer and a suspected participant in violence, though he dodged homicide convictions and prosecutors found it hard to turn suspicions into proof. The line between documented fact and rumor can blur in underworld stories. In his case, convictions for extortion were real. Involvement in loan sharking and bookmaking was proven by testimony and surveillance, and his standing as a trusted San Diego figure in the Los Angeles family was clear to anyone who watched that world closely. He also had a domestic life that did not fit the caricature. Neighbors sometimes saw him watering a lawn, carrying groceries, or chatting on a sidewalk with an unhurried ease. He took long walks. He chatted with store owners who liked his business. Those who did not know who he was might have seen a middle-aged man with an old country walk. Those who knew placed their eyes on the floor or looked past him as if he were not there. He allowed no obvious chaos near his home. He kept disputes out of sight. That separation was part of his craft. By the middle of the 1,950 seconds, the Los Angeles family felt the end of one era and the beginning of another. Jack Dragna's death in 1956 ushered in different leadership, and the balance of power across the West Coast shifted. Las Vegas drew more attention and money. Federal surveillance grew sharper. Senate hearings probed organized crime, and Los Angeles, long viewed as a sleepy cousin to bigger crime centers, found itself covered by the same spotlight. In that climate, Frank's conservative style remained an asset. He could stitch San Diego together while bosses argued, and while Hollywood headlines distracted less cautious operators. He kept routines, low-voiced meetings, early evening walks, cash and paper bags counted twice, then counted again. None of that made him less dangerous. The record shows that he used threats against business owners who missed payments, oversaw collections from bookmakers, and pressed debtors, using the fear that stands behind loan sharking and extortion. He was questioned after outbreaks of violence that followed pressure campaigns. Trusted sources told investigators that he approved punishments or helped set up men who had betrayed the local rules. But those sources often died, disappeared, or changed their stories. Time after time, he slipped away from serious outcomes. When consequences finally arrived, they came in the form of extortion convictions that were strong enough to withstand appeals. He went to prison, serving years that took him out of circulation. When he returned, he resumed old habits, because that world does not usually offer late career changes. In San Diego, his name opened doors that were closed to strangers. If a bookmaker wanted protection, he asked a friend to put in a word. If a bar owner felt pressure from drunks, he bought a new kind of insurance that came with a nod from Frank's circle. He was not the only man who could do that work, but few did it as quietly or as long. The city grew, the Navy expanded, suburbs spread. And still the under-the-table economy thrived in pockets where the lights remained dim and cash still passed from palm to palm. He spoke with gamblers who operated out of back rooms near the waterfront. He kept an eye on men who traveled between Los Angeles, Tijuana, and San Diego with envelopes tucked into jackets. The job was coordination, and the tool was fear, administered in measured doses that rarely left immediate marks visible to the public. Some allege that he took part in high-profile murders in Los Angeles during the years when gangland rivalries turned violent. It is fair to say that many homicide detectives believed he had knowledge of, and possibly roles in, certain unsolved killings. It is also fair to note that he was never convicted of murder, and that many such claims came from informants with motives, from hearsay, or from rival criminals who liked to smear the man they feared. Responsible reporting separates proven facts from claims, and the proven facts about his crimes are these. He helped run bookmaking and loan, sharking in San Diego for the Los Angeles organization. He used intimidation to collect money. He engaged in extortion, a felony for which he was convicted. He maintained corrupt ties that helped shield those rackets. He spent time in prison, and he elevated younger men who learned the same trade. What made him different was discipline. He avoided intoxicants during business. He did not fall for the trap of boasting. He took no joy in wild nights, because wild nights drew cops and cameras. He kept things plain. That plainness disguised the harm. Families who fell into debt paid rent late, then stopped paying. Shop owners lost businesses when interest swallowed their profits. Bookmakers who fell behind disappeared. He was the one people thought of when they tried to figure out why a man who owed money suddenly packed a car and left town. He did not need to shout to make that happen. He lived with a paradox. The more careful he became, the more attention he drew from investigators who admired the craft but hated the pain it spread. They watched him move from his home to the cafe, from the cafe to a diner near the water, from the diner to a phone booth where he dialed from memory. They took pictures of him shaking hands with men they also watched. They built charts with circles and lines, and his name, sometimes shortened to a nickname, sat near the center of the page. The charts did not convict anyone, but they told a story of connections. In California, where the sun burns bright, those lines hid under awnings, behind blinds, and in cars parked nose first to the curb. He aged into a figure with deep standing. Younger associates asked for his advice on disputes and splits. When a bookmaker died or retired, he helped reassign clients. If a police raid hit a card room, he checked on who had been taken in and who had gotten out the back. He might bring money to a wife whose husband had been arrested, so that rent got paid and loyalty did not crack. He believed in systems that lasted. That was the philosophy beneath the crimes. It required routine, discipline, and quiet. It required the willingness to scare people, but not push so far that they sought help from the police. That balance is fragile. He kept it intact for years. By the end of the 1,950 seconds, conditions were changing again. Leadership shifts in Los Angeles would soon create the kind of internal strain that tests even strong bonds. Federal focus would sharpen with new tools. Television would bring committee hearings into living rooms, turning secret names into nightly news. New money streams would appear, from Las Vegas to resort developments, enticing some men to chase bigger scores and tempting them to make calls that violated old rules. Frank still held San Diego tight, still walked at dusk, still used payphones, still counted cash by feel. He did not trust the big stage. He trusted the next quiet meeting at a corner table, and the next folded note that held a name, a number, and a sum that had to be paid. The first hint that the tide had turned was not a shout or a siren, but a knock. It came at mid-morning, drumming once on a screen door that never answered whim. He waited, counted to 5, opened to a man with a plain tie and a flat expression, accepted an envelope, and closed the door. Inside, the air stayed cool. He read the lines, traced a signature, and went to the kitchen for coffee he did not drink. Outside, kids on bicycles chased each other past hedges. The city went on with its ordinary heartbeat. He stood still and thought about which payphone to use, which name to call, and what not to say. A summons brings a test. Do you hide, show up, or send a message that your silence is not for sale? The paper did not frighten him. It reminded him that new eyes were watching, stronger than before, more patient than the cops who once tried to spook him with flashbulbs at a curb. He folded the document, put it under a stack of mail, and stepped out into the Sunday quiet men can feel when a horizon is moving. The death of Jack Dragna in 1956 had left a space that could not be filled by charm or lineage. The Los Angeles organization lived through a nervous handoff to Frank D. Simone, a lawyer by trade whose grasp of courtroom rules did not translate into respect on the street. The old web that held Los Angeles and San Diego together under Dragna's order sagged. Some men chased easy money or big promises. Others, like Frank, kept their heads down and tended their plots. He did not advertise opinions, but in discreet circles he was known as a man who believed the boss should stay out of headlines and hold a tight rein over collectors, bookmakers, and anyone who used the family's name to peddle fear. He did what he always did: stabilized San Diego, kept track of numbers, settled disputes before they grew, and made sure outsiders paid or left. Then the national spotlight moved west. After the 1957 meeting at Appalachian blew apart under the weight of state troopers and reporters, every agency in America decided to build charts and fill them with names. California's sunny reputation did not shield it. The Kefauver years had already introduced senators to bookmaking and wire services. Now the post-Appalachian climate made even cautious men feel heat. Frank adjusted. He used fewer houses and more payphones. He increased the space between meetings. He relied on trusted couriers who had no idea how their tasks fit into the larger picture. He learned which coffee shops kept booths by the back door, and which had mirrors that gave a clear view of whoever walked in next. San Diego's rackets could look simple to a stranger. Bookmaking moved on calls, notes, and the fast relay of race results. Loan collections ran on the ability to make a man choose his next payment over a complaint to police. Vending routes, jukeboxes, and backroom games in small clubs provided steady cash and quiet rooms for conversation. Frank placed himself at the junction of these streams. When bookmakers fell behind, he sent men who used few words and left faster than they arrived. When a tavern owner wanted a partner who brought peace and protection, he arranged it and took his cut. Investigators wrote it all down. Surveillance logs followed the same car to the same places and recorded meetings in short phrases that became paragraphs, then files. Arrests came, as they always did, counts tied to threats, to conspiracy, to using fear to collect. Some cases fell apart when witnesses claimed they could not remember or moved away. Not every case collapsed. In the late 1952, he entered federal custody on an extortion conviction that had enough concrete under it to stand after appeals. He did time and kept his mouth shut. That too was part of the profession. Prison did not mellow him so much as sharpen a habit of patience. He measured men by how they handled boredom, how they absorbed slight changes in routine, how they carried themselves when told to wait. He read, exercised, and kept his mind on the network outside. Family sent letters that passed censors. Lawyers passed messages that did not look like messages. When he walked out, San Diego felt both familiar and altered. The Navy town had grown. Suburbs crept up hills. Money moved in new patterns. He returned to old haunts and gauged who was still solid, who had drifted, and which businesses could be rebuilt without drawing undue noise. He kept fronts that made sense in a coastal city. A bar where fishermen and sailors could blend with office workers. A diner that served breakfast and stayed open late. A small office that looked like a legit service shop, where no one could guess that the real product was quiet negotiation. He found value in machines that churned coins in the corner. Music boxes, cigarette dispensers, pinball. Those routes required pickups and placements, and the scheduling of pickups brought regular meetings. Regular meetings required oversight. Oversight created a web thicker than any one man, which suited him. He wanted a system that did not require him to show his face unless a promise had been broken. Through the early 1960 seconds, he remained what Los Angeles needed in San Diego, a man who could be relied upon, who could arbitrate disagreements between bookmakers, who could steer independent operators toward paying for the privilege of working without trouble. He went to Los Angeles for meetings that mattered, slipped into back rooms where older men weighed news from Las Vegas and from the East, and returned to San Diego before midnight. His name carried weight, though he did not use it carelessly. If he said a payment was due, it was due. If a man missed once and then twice, a firmer reminder followed. Police saw the same pattern again and again after raids. Businesses that had been warned about illegal machines or card games reopened under a new name or with a different owner on paper. The faces around them rarely changed. The DeSimone years produced friction not because Frank sought it, but because he clung to standards he believed kept men alive. He distrusted show, sloppy talk, and bosses who treated respect like a costume. Rumors ran that he had been pushed aside for stretches, put on the shelf, as the phrase went, by leadership that did not want to hear counsel from a man who had survived longer than many of them. Shelving meant a loss of formal standing. It did not erase relationships or the habit of men in San Diego to seek his judgment. He bided time and waited out leadership he considered weak. Even shelved, he could whisper advice to a bookmaker who feared a takeover by strangers, or tell a young collector how not to turn a collection into a police report. He did not work alone. The man who would later become the most famous voice in telling the West Coast's underworld story, Jimmy Fratiano, moved through those years with Frank near his shoulder. They were not the same kind of man. Jimmy liked a larger canvas, a faster pace. Frank was a stone in a river that never drifted. Each brought something the other used. Fratiano sought his approval on San Diego matters, and occasionally pulled him toward Los Angeles disputes that spilled into Orange County or back down the coast. Together they managed Shylock money cash at high interest that never made it to a bank ledger. They reminded clients to pay and, when needed, reorganized debts to prevent a public mess. Nothing about it was romantic. It was accounting with threats in the margins. Investigators tied both men to those patterns through interviews, toll records, and, in time, testimony that would come from inside the life. National pressure rose again under a new wave of federal programs that treated organized crime as a long war. The FBI's top hoodlum, focus in the early 960 seconds, turned agents into specialists. They learned to sit quiet, to build informants, to wait for chances instead of rushing a case. Frank felt that evolution. He knew how to spot tails, how to disappear into side streets, how to draw a car past its comfort zone and then lose it. Yet he also knew that patient surveillance burrows into a man's day and never leaves. He responded by shrinking his world even more. Fewer phone calls, more face-to-face meetings, shorter sentences that could be denied. No written notes unless nothing else would do, and even then on paper that disappeared. He had a personal life that did not match the grimmer contours of his profession. Mornings could find him on a patio with coffee, greeting neighbors by name. He liked to walk near the water at dusk. He laughed with grandchildren in a backyard that smelled of cut grass. Those who saw only that side would have sworn he sold small goods or retired from a civil service job. He kept arguments out of his home. He never brought loud friends to front steps or hosted boozy sessions that could draw sirens. Detachment was his rule. Family was family. Work was work. That boundary gave him the calm face that made him both reassuring to friends and unnerving to enemies. The 1,960 seconds also brought temptations that he resisted. Narcotics money seduced some men on the coast. Frank understood the profits and also the prison terms. He had lived long enough to know which revenue streams, though illegal, left less exposure. Bookmaking and loans were bad enough. They made money without the same federal sentences that followed drugs. He steered his circle toward the older formulas. He used the same philosophy when men proposed flashy plays tied to Las Vegas. California's role in Las Vegas money was real, but it brought a different scale of federal attention. He counseled caution. He favored steady returns over a run that could light up a newsroom. Arrests continued to dot the calendar. He was grabbed on suspicion of conspiring to threaten a man who had fallen behind, hauled before a judge, and then released when the government could not carry its burden. He faced subpoenas and invoked his right to remain silent. He refused to cooperate with grand juries that wanted a tour guide to the map of San Diego's gray economy. In one case, he and others were charged under federal extortion statutes, built to cover protection money and collections. That prosecution stuck. He served another term and returned with the same deliberate temperament, older and even more careful. Each time he re-entered, police who had trailed him for years had to start their notebooks again, because a man like him did not explain where he had been or why. By mid-decade, the family's leadership shifted again. Nick Licata brought a different tone from DeSimone. Licata had years behind him and a quieter manner that Frank respected more. Though respect did not erase skepticism, San Diego's value to Los Angeles stayed the same, a stable cash machine that could be managed without press. Frank still had standing there, even if politics in Los Angeles occasionally benched him. He ran meetings in booths with blinds half pulled, in parking lots where two men talking at an open trunk looked like neighbors discussing a flat tire. He reminded the young ones to keep the scene bland. He kept bar owners informed about when to turn machines off before inspections. He counted envelopes and sent the right shares north. The strain that finally bent his path came from two directions at once. Federal pressure grew smarter and offered him, as it offered others, a way to survive if he agreed to talk. At the same time, the family's internal politics left him exposed. Old allies died or lost influence. New men, eager to prove toughness, resented his quiet authority. He saw how quickly a lifetime of service could be repaid with doubt. To a man who had practiced caution since his youth, the calculus sharpened into a choice: cling to a structure that no longer protected him or use the government's interest to carve out a narrower, safer road. He did not make speeches about it. He did not announce it to friends. He began meeting federal agents in a way that matched his nature. Public places, steady eye contact, short statements, nothing on paper that did not have to be, and no promises he could not keep to himself. In time, he became what the Bureau would later call a top echelon source, the kind whose information could shape broader cases. He described how collections worked, who called whom, what meetings meant, and where lines ran in Southern California between factions and families. He gave them structure more than sensational stories, and that structure mattered. The agents knew he remained in the life while he talked. They accepted the contradiction because it gave them proximity. He accepted it because it kept him breathing. Even as he cooperated, he behaved as if every phone might be monitored and every car behind him might be more than a commuter. He chose payphones next to loud radios or near traffic, where a microphone would catch more noise than words. He learned agent habits and made sure they learned his. Meetings were canceled without apology if he saw something he did not like. He would not let desperation or ego push him into a rash move. He demanded something in return. He wanted assurance that his name would not float into the open and that his family would not pay for his choices. Agents promised what they could. He knew promises have limits once a case hits a courtroom. He kept secrets even from those wearing badges. Law enforcement gathered confidence from his guidance. They understood San Diego's card rooms, the real ownership of bars that traveled from cousin to cousin on paper, the nicknames attached to phone numbers, the routines around race days and holidays. He confirmed suspicions about alliances between the Los Angeles family and operators in Orange County and the Inland Empire. He diagrammed how a complaint about a loan in a small neighborhood could become a meeting in Los Angeles if a borrower had a relative who mattered. He resisted the urge to embellish. Agents who worked with him respected that restraint. It made what he did say harder to dismiss. None of this erased what he had done or what he continued to do. He was still a collector. Still a man whose name could turn a late payment into a quick payment. He still handled shy money and still held quiet equity in businesses where cash passed from hand to hand all day. The harm remained. Families struggled under debts they could not shake. Independent bookmakers who miscalculated their exposure learned hard lessons. He had chosen to live in that world long before the Bureau sat across from him with notebooks open. The cooperation did not transform him into a civic figure. It was a survival strategy, carefully implemented by a man who always played the long game. Suspicion in his world is a scent that lingers. No one said it out loud at first, but men who had always trusted him began, in small ways, to keep him at a distance or test his reactions. A question would arrive twice from two different messengers. A meeting place would be changed at the last minute to see if a cop car appeared. A man he had known for 20 years would ask him to vouch for someone, as if their shared history did not speak loudly enough. He recognized the feeling. He had seen it applied to others. He accepted that it would come to him sooner or later. He did what he had always done, walked carefully, talked less, and watched for signs that the ground under his feet was shifting. The late 1,960 seconds closed with him balancing on a thin ridge. On one side stood the only system he had ever known, now led by men whose judgment he questioned and whose loyalty he was no longer sure he could trust. On the other side stood federal agents collecting details that could alter careers and cages. In the middle stood San Diego, still humming with its quiet economy, still willing to pay for peace kept by a man who looked like anyone else on the street. He remained the figure who could settle a dispute with a nod, make a call that cleared a path for a truck to make deliveries to a back door, or tell a young bookmaker how much to keep on hand after payday. He did not flinch from his work. He simply began for the first time to hold two ledgers in his head, one that kept the life running and one that told him how to survive it. Dawn in San Diego has a way of making everything look forgiven. The sky goes pale, gulls circle, and the last bar stools sit empty like they've learned a lesson. He liked those hours. Less talk, more clarity. A man could count what he had left. Friends who still took your call, enemies who had grown patient, and habits that kept you alive when the calendar pages started to thin. He moved slower than he had in his 30s, but he moved with purpose. He still trusted his feet more than he trusted a car, still believed you could learn more by watching a door from across the street than by pushing through it. He knew the names of the grocers who opened early and the managers who stepped out to smoke before breakfast. Those little rhythms told him who slept well and who didn't. He kept a list in his head that no one else could see. The change at the top in Los Angeles sent ripples that reached all the way down the coast. Nick Licata kept a lid on fires that had smoldered under DeSimone. And for a while the older order seemed to reassert itself. A boss who preferred calm suits quiet men. Frank resumed the old San Diego routine with renewed confidence. Steady control of betting, a firm hold on routes that fed coin boxes, and the kind of influence that let him settle quarrels without a public mess. He had a way of reducing a room to first principles. Who owes what? Who gets made whole? Who walks away with his pride intact so he doesn't start a war to save face? That skill set made money and prevented noise. It also protected him at a time when federal attention was tightening. Agents were learning the long game. They studied patterns, trusted paper more than rumor, and built cases out of silence that stretched for months. He sensed it. There were days when a shadow stayed one car back longer than felt natural, or when a face showed up at different locations with a different jacket and the same posture. He adjusted by making his life smaller. Fewer meetings that looked like meetings. More simple errands that doubled as check-ins. No speeches, no slips. If he had to deliver a message, he did it with ordinary words. The point would arrive clear enough, because history carried its own punctuation. He had already spent real time behind bars by then, not a weekend, not a few weeks, but years that reflected the weight of an extortion case built well enough to stand. He went in, kept his head, and came out older and more certain of what worked. Appeals rarely saved men in his line. Discipline did. He had learned that from the beginning. He did not deny who he was, or what he had done to get there. He accepted the part he played in a machine that turned fear into money and made sure he took his share without inviting disaster. He also understood that prison marks a man even after the gate opens. People watch you closer, both the ones with badges and the ones who think your judgment has been dulled by walls. His partnership with Jimmy Fratiano deepened in those years. They were not mirror images, but they fit together where it counted. Jimmy brought reach, contacts that stretched from Hollywood to Las Vegas, and outright nerve when a decision needed to land heavy. Frank brought steadiness, a compass tuned to what would still make sense in 6 months. Together they kept San Diego profitable for Los Angeles, while managing personalities that could spoil everything faster than a police raid. They tracked betting layers and loan payments, redistributed obligations when a bookmaker got overwhelmed, and made sure tribute moved north without drama. That work was illegal and corrosive. It pulled money from neighborhoods and kept people quiet who might otherwise have asked for help. He knew that. He did it anyway. The border gave San Diego a character no other West Coast city had. Tijuana sat close enough to visit in an afternoon, and traffic ran both ways. Nightlife, small casinos and bars drew tourists and locals alike. Smugglers moved every kind of commodity. He kept a careful distance from trade that brought a different species of federal attention. He had seen narcotics ruin men who otherwise could have stayed in their lane for decades. He pressed his people to make money in the old ways. Wagering, loans, machines that spun lights and music while quarters fell into trays. The older forms carried risk, but they didn't bring the same headlines or sentences. That was his calculation, cold, practical, built for survival. Law enforcement files from that period place him at the center of San Diego activity that touched many corners of daily life. A bartender who wanted his place to stay calm on weekends learned that a silent partner could deliver quiet. A bookmaker working out of a back office in a tire shop discovered that late payers paid faster when they believed a seasoned man knew their name. A man behind on a shy loan learned that interest never slept. These scenes repeated block by block. They were the unseen economy of a growing city. The effect on families was steady and harsh. Debts ate into groceries and rent. People told themselves each payment was the last one until it wasn't. In that chain of cause and effect, his name sat where decisions got made. By the late 1960 seconds, he had stepped into a role that would have sounded impossible to his younger self. He began talking to federal agents, controlled, limited, in a fashion that matched his temperament. He did not spill everything. He did not glamorize. He laid out structures. Who reported to whom in Southern California, how the money flowed, which businesses masked the real work. He confirmed what investigators suspected and added context that turned loose threads into a pattern. Those sessions did not excuse his past or soften what he kept doing. They were a parallel track that he believed might keep him safe in a world where loyalty could dissolve faster than fog in mid-morning Sunday. If he wanted proof that safety was relative, he only had to look at internal politics in Los Angeles. Aging bosses gave way to men who inherited power without inheriting the same respect. Younger figures pressed for a pace he did not trust. They liked loud restaurants and fast deals. He wanted neither. Rumors swirled that he had been benched for a time, officially outside the circle, even while people still sought his counsel. Shelving a man like him did not erase decades of connection. It could, however, plant a seed of doubt that would sprout later when fear needed a target. He recognized that risk and managed it with the only tools he trusted: routine, restraint, and a memory long enough to spot traps. Nick Licata's death in 1974 forced another transition that would matter. Dominic Brooklier stepped into the top role, a boss who had done his time and knew the stakes. The family needed money and order. San Diego remained a vital source of both, and Frank maintained his grip there. He resumed formal standing in a way that acknowledged two truths at once. The organization required his skill, and some men near the center did not like how much weight he carried. He played his part anyway, because there were not many parts left for a man his age in that world. He counted envelopes, settled splits, and refused proposals that, in his view, brought too much heat for too little return. The Bureau valued him precisely because he refused heat. He gave them charts without theater, and names without bravado. He did not pretend to be a hero. He framed his information as facts learned in the daily operation of a local system that touched thousands of lives without leaving a press release. To the agents, he was a rare window into a tight room. To him, the arrangement was survival under pressure created by forces he could not fully control. Sharper federal tools, interstate coordination, and rivals who liked the idea of running San Diego without having to earn it. He had no illusions that any promise of confidentiality could last forever. He just needed it to last long enough. He walked a tightrope that grew thinner with each season. The men he sat with at corner tables now included new faces who had proved themselves in loud ways he disliked. They tested him with extra questions, last-minute location changes, or sudden requests designed to see how he reacted. He passed most of those tests because he expected them, but no man passes all of them forever. His habit of caution, which had kept him alive, could be read by others as reluctance or as a sign he held something back. A rumor whispered fast can become a story, and a story can become a verdict in a room where votes are cast with nods rather than ballots. San Diego itself changed under his feet. Navy contracts fueled growth. Freeways cut new lines across the map. New money opened restaurants where old-timers felt out of place. The small bars he used as fronts had to modernize or die. He adapted by mixing old methods with new faces, letting sons and nephews of men he trusted learn the basics while he avoided any display that would draw a newspaper photograph. He insisted on an invisible hand. To a passerby, he looked like a man reading a paper at a counter. To those who knew, his presence signaled that a question would be answered and a bill would be paid. He never stopped reminding his circle that violence done in haste invites police work that lasts for months. He believed in pressure applied with calculation. If someone needed a stronger reminder, It came in a way that didn't turn a quiet neighborhood into a crime scene that stayed on the evening news. Detectives connected his name to incidents where people changed their tune after brief encounters in parking lots or at back doors. They believed he sanctioned retaliation when lines were crossed, though they could not make a homicide case stick to his back. He understood that uncertainty helped him as much as it frustrated investigators. Doubt is armor in his world. Las Vegas pulled at some of the younger West Coast men like a neon tide. Chicago had a strong footprint there, and alliances crossed city lines. Jimmy traveled there for business, gambling and otherwise, and returned with stories about casino floors, security men with good ears, and the sense that the desert magnified both risk and reward. Frank measured those tales and trimmed his sails accordingly. He understood that the bigger the score, the bigger the fall. He tried to keep San Diego out of desert wars he did not control. That choice put him at odds with men who wanted to use his backyard as a staging ground for plays anchored 2 states away. He refused when he could, compromised when he must, and kept an eye on who resented it. Grand juries did not quit. Subpoenas hit his mailbox at intervals that felt like a metronome. He appeared when ordered and invoked his rights with a tone that suggested fatigue rather than defiance. Prosecutors wanted more than he would give. He accepted the risk that contempt might follow, but also that pressing too far could add charges he could not afford. He had built a life on knowing when to talk and when to fold a sentence into a nod. In courtrooms, he trimmed his answers to the width of what the law allowed. In coffee shops, he spoke with more ease, but never in a way that could be fairly quoted. His family life stayed orderly by design. Holidays were observed, birthdays noted, small gifts chosen with care. He did not make his wife part of his work or drag friends from one world into the other. Neighbors saw him carry groceries, water a strip of lawn, and lift a child to point at a jet flying low toward the base. That contrast did not absolve him. It humanized him to people who struggled to match the quiet man on their block to the figure in news clippings about vice and extortion. He allowed that confusion because it served him, though it weighed more each year. Double lives are heavy even for men who think they were built for it. By the mid-1970s, the stress lines were visible. Licata was gone. Brooklier, smart and wary, faced cases that promised to take him off the board for stretches. When a boss is under pressure, suspicion becomes a currency traded in whispers. Frank heard his own name in that market often enough to know the risk had turned from background noise into a threat. Friends advised him to lie low. He had never done anything else. He kept his circuit small, kept meetings short, reduced the distance between his front door and the places where he had to show his face. He insisted that nothing about San Diego's operation needed to change. Change draws light. He always favored shade. The Bureau wanted more from him as the decade pushed on. They had stuck with him through slow seasons, and now they wanted to translate his maps into cases. He negotiated his cooperation with the same calm he brought to collections. No theatrics, no promises he couldn't keep, no moves that would put his children at risk. He knew his name would surface if trials grew big. He also knew that some men in Los Angeles needed a scapegoat for failures they had created themselves. He was a perfect candidate. Old enough to be expendable. Important enough that eliminating him would send a message. Careful enough that any mistake could be framed as betrayal. He kept notes in his head, not on paper. He tested the loyalty of men who had called him mentor by sending out small requests and watching how fast they returned. He paid attention to who started a conversation with a joke and who opened with a stare. He trimmed his circle to a handful and tried to live inside the space he could control. You can prepare for a lot in that line of work. You can build habits that put you one step ahead this week and next. But you cannot eliminate chance or the resentments of men who believe their future requires your absence. He understood that. He set his jaw and kept walking. There is a moment in every long career when the past no longer shields the present. He felt that moment arrive like a change in weather. San Diego still hummed, the border still tempted, the coin boxes still grew heavy by Sunday night, but the mood had shifted. The young talked louder, the old whispered more, and the space for a careful man narrowed. He did not quit. A lifetime of action taught him not to. He did the next task, took the next call, met the next car 2 blocks from the usual spot. He believed in the power of small decisions to fend off big ones. For a while, that belief held. He had been for decades the most dangerous kind of figure, Unassuming, effective, hard to catch, harder to replace. That profile kept him at the center of San Diego's underworld and kept him useful to the people building cases against it. It also guaranteed that he would stand alone when both sides decided the price of his survival had grown too high. The signal that the endgame was approaching did not arrive with trumpets. It came as a series of small requests that didn't fit, glances that lingered a second too long, and errands designed to put him in places where a man could be reached without witnesses. He noted each one, filed the observations where he kept everything else, and tried to proceed as if caution alone could blunt what was coming. He learned to read a city's mood, the way a card mechanic reads a deck, fingertip light, never forcing it. In the mid-1970 seconds, the hum in San Diego changed pitch. Growth brought new storefronts, new apartment blocks, more traffic, and more strangers who didn't know the old boundaries. He adjusted by shrinking his movements. He favored sidewalks with 2 exits and booths, where he could see the door without turning his head. He didn't change his walk. That steady pace had carried him across decades. He still nodded to clerks at corner markets, still paused to watch the water at the end of a street, still kept conversations brief. What changed was the gap between thought and speech. He let silence do most of the work. Leadership up the road entered another turnover. After Nick Licata's death in 1974, Dominic Brooklier took the chair in Los Angeles. He was seasoned, careful with his words, and aware that the family needed earnings without headlines. San Diego had always been a quiet engine. Frank's value rose again. The shelving of earlier years ended. Men who understood West Coast politics knew what that meant. He regained formal standing and was expected to restore order on the coast. He accepted the role without theatrics. He had never needed a title to get things done, but a title kept amateurs from wandering into his lanes. He focused on the parts of the map that made money while leaving the smallest trail. He refreshed routes that had been let go to seed. Coin-operated machines and jukeboxes sound small to outsiders, but in the hands of disciplined men they are regular cash and regular meetings, the 2 ingredients that hold a network together. He placed or protected those machines in bars and diners, collected on an exact schedule, and split proceeds the same way every time. He did the same with backroom card games and off-track wagering. The games couldn't run without confidence that no one would kick the door in halfway through a hand. Confidence is what he sold. In taverns where tempers ran hot on weekends, he arranged for a quiet partner to take a piece, and with that piece came calm. If someone balked, a second conversation often solved it. When a second conversation didn't, a third came with a tone that carried the memory of what happened to people who ignored money owed to his circle. He didn't need to raise his voice for that message to land. Files from city police and federal offices show him moving in measured loops through these years, taking meetings in small rooms and parking lots, running regular collections, and guiding bookmakers who called when they took on more action than they could cover. His name surfaced in complaints tied to extortion, conspiracy to collect by intimidation, and loans that grew faster than a borrower could pay. Some cases washed out for lack of testimony. At least, one didn't. He had already served real time on a federal extortion conviction years earlier, and later faced another successful prosecution. He did not break ranks in court or in prison. He refused to cooperate with grand juries that wanted him to name names. He invoked his rights and sat through the rest. When he walked out, he resumed what he had done before, older and more disciplined, aware that every hour of freedom had a cost. By then he had begun an arrangement with the FBI that reflected his survival instincts. Agents categorized him as a top echelon source, someone whose knowledge came from the center of things rather than from street rumor. He didn't bring them theatrics. He brought structure, who oversaw which parts of San Diego, which bars served as reliable meeting spots, how envelopes moved up the chain, which phone booths were more than phone booths. He gave them context that transformed scattered notes into a map. He kept the meetings short, and in places where ambient noise complicated any recording that might exist, he insisted that agents respect his methods. In return, he gave them information that helped their long cases take shape. He didn't mistake the arrangement for friendship, and he didn't stop doing the work that made him valuable to Los Angeles. He managed contradiction because the alternative was to surrender control of his fate to men whose judgment he didn't trust. Suspicion circulates when leadership changes. A man can be reinstated, and still live under a cloud. He knew it. He had pushed through earlier doubts without showing resentment. He attempted the same now, but the climate felt different. Younger faces sat at tables where he had met men who were gone. Those younger faces liked speed, spectacle, and bigger plays that promised quick stacks. He was not impressed by speed. He argued for the long view. Steady income, few disturbances, no narcotics, no wild ventures that would pull federal heat. To certain ears, caution sounded like hesitation. Hesitation looked like deception. That was the trap. He saw it and kept marching, because he had no other way. Fratiano's orbit overlapped with his through this period more than ever. Jimmy ran fast through Los Angeles and Las Vegas, chasing opportunities, settling arguments, and wading into disputes that crossed family lines. Frank provided ballast. He said yes when the math worked, no when it didn't. Together they stabilized San Diego and protected the cut meant for Los Angeles. They coordinated loans to regulars who could be counted on to pay and reorganized debts for bookmakers who had misread a weekend's action. They responded to pressure from new operators who wanted to set up shop without recognizing the existing order. Where it made sense, they folded those operators into the system with a fee. Where it didn't, they applied pressure that reminded everyone that the coast was already spoken for. Investigators linked both men to these patterns through surveillance, toll records, and, later, sworn testimony. It was a repeatable model, and repeatable models are what keep illegal economies going. He didn't show up in nightclubs with camera flashes. He kept to the older way. His assets were modest-looking, a piece of a bar, a percentage of coin machines in a string of cafes, a quiet interest in a banquet room that rented out to family events and union luncheons. Those interests created legitimate paper with tidy numbers and tax filings that matched what a man of his means might report. Behind that paper lived the real business. A bookmaker using the back office in a body shop needed to settle with a layer in Los Angeles. Frank reminded him to set aside enough cash on Friday afternoon so that a bad Saturday didn't become a shoot-the-lights-out disaster. A small bar on a busy corner needed a machine route that wouldn't be interrupted by weekend inspections. Frank arranged the placement and made sure the timing of collections avoided predictable patterns. He ran San Diego like a man tending a garden. Weed, water. Never boast about harvests. Meanwhile, agents pressed for more. Washington wanted outcomes, not just organizational charts. The Bureau's big cases depended on patient layering of informants, surveillance, and financial analysis. His value lay in explaining the scaffolding, but the scaffolding had to lead to indictments. He knew what they wanted and gave what he could without painting a target on his face in letters big enough to be read across the room. He canceled meetings when something felt off. He switched locations twice in a single afternoon. He demanded that agents keep his name deep under wraps. He was realistic about the limits of secrecy. Courtrooms drag secrets into daylight. He counted on time and timing. Get the right facts to the right people at the right moment, and maybe that moment would buy him a few more seasons. The toll for double duty shows up in small slips. Men he had known for decades started to repeat questions, as if testing whether he'd change an answer by a word. Meeting spots were switched at the last minute, not because of police, but to see whether a patrol car cruised past at the new location. Requests arrived that didn't align with his long-stated rules, spur-of-the-moment jobs with high risk and no clear upside. He refused what he had always refused. In a stable time, that refusal would have been seen as good sense. In a nervous time, it smelled like defiance. He saw that shift and understood he could not talk his way around it. He would have to live his habits and hope they kept him alive. He also found himself at odds with a few loud earners whose methods clashed with his. Some were tied to casino work in Nevada, where the Chicago outfit and other outside interests had influence. Those men sought leverage on the coast, using Las Vegas money and reputations as crowbars. Frank didn't mind taking a cut when the risk fit the return. He minded outsiders treating San Diego like a hallway they could stomp down without checking who had the keys. He said so quietly and consistently. That stance made him the person to blame whenever a deal stalled. And stalled deals turned into stories told in Los Angeles about an old man losing his edge. Rumor is a fast river. Facts are stones on the bottom. He bent to pick up the stones. The river kept moving. Home stayed home. He stayed attentive to the small details that made a household feel safe. A car that got serviced on schedule, a porch light that worked, a calendar marked with birthdays and school performances. He never brought strangers to the door. He never used his house as a place of business. He walked neighborhoods at hours when the street felt like it belonged to dog walkers and people returning from a late shift. Neighbors knew him as courteous and predictable. That predictability was a shield built over decades, a shield that made him seem smaller than he was to anyone who didn't understand how the city's hidden economy worked. The last full year of his life closed in slow motion. Federal lawyers assembled long complaints against Los Angeles leadership, leaning on informants and recorded conversations to tie the family's routine income to a broader pattern that could carry racketeering charges. Inside the life, the sense of being watched turned from a suspicion into a constant. Old friends died, retired, or slid into the background. Newer faces treated history as a suggestion. He kept San Diego steady through all of it, still meeting bookmakers at midday, still visiting bars at off hours, still using payphones with his back angled so he could see reflections in the glass. He never believed a single detail would save him. He believed thousands might. He kept notes in his head about who showed up late and who showed up early, who smiled a second too long, who stared at his hands while he talked. He tracked a series of small misalignments that pointed toward an outcome he could describe but not stop. Missed signals, messages that bypassed him, responsibilities reassigned without being called a reassignment. A man doesn't last as long as he did without seeing patterns. He saw this one and accepted that no conversation would reverse it. His answer was to maintain routine so completely that deviation would stand out like a flare. Routine had saved him before. Maybe it would again. On a February evening in 1977, winter soft on the coast, the kind of night that draws people outside without coats, he did what he always did. He took a walk after dinner. He chose a route lit by storefronts and street lamps, and the glow from windows in second-floor apartments. He stopped at a small market where he knew the owner's first name and nodded a hello. A payphone near the entrance sat where it always sat, metal cool, glass smudged by fingerprints that said the whole neighborhood passed through. The phone began to ring as he stepped past. He paused. He had met phones like this all his life. He had used them to organize pickups, to keep appointments short, to remind people to stay on schedule. He reached out and lifted the receiver. The night held its breath. A figure stepped from the edge of the lot with the timing of someone who had studied his habits. The call had brought him to that spot at that moment. A brief burst of sound, small and flat in the open air, ended a long career built on quiet. The person who had waited for the chance moved away quickly, leaving the street to its usual hum, leaving a man known for caution on the ground near a phone built for anonymous contact. In seconds, the scene returned to ordinary life. The glow of storefronts, footsteps on concrete, engines idling at a light. Strangers looked up, startled by movement they couldn't place. Sirens came later, not because anyone expected them, but because that is what happens when a life stops in public view. The call that drew him to the receiver was not random. It fit a pattern used across that era by people who wanted to control a meeting with the smallest footprint. He trusted payphones because they had kept him safe for decades. He trusted routine because routine had protected him. The men who wanted him gone knew that about him. They placed a lure he would not read as a threat until it was too late. That method matched the logic of the world he had helped shape. Minimal spectacle, maximum certainty. The message they sent was as old as the code he lived by. Information and loyalty are life, and suspicion ends both. San Diego police reached the scene and began the first round of questions. Who had seen him arrive? Did anyone notice a person waiting nearby? Were there cameras in any storefronts that might have pointed toward the phone? The street gave little back. Neighbors described a quiet evening with people going in and out of a small market. A clerk remembered him passing, as he often did, and the phone ringing at the moment he stepped close. The attack was clean, the exit fast. There were no dramatic chases. There were no speeches. A careful man had been met by careful planning. Agents from the FBI joined quickly. They knew his importance, not only to the Los Angeles organization, but to their own files. He was a top echelon source, an informant of unusual rank who had explained the framework of San Diego's rackets with a precision that desk charts could not match without a guide. His cooperation had not been a secret within the Bureau. but it had been protected with layers of caution. Now, the calculus changed. A source had been eliminated in a way that suggested the people who wanted him gone were not guessing. They were acting on strong belief, or on knowledge, that he had talked. The theory that rose immediately in law enforcement circles and among those still in the life was the same. The order had come from Los Angeles leadership, carried out by men who knew his routes and who could count on him to answer a familiar phone. The news ran fast through bars and card rooms. Some men felt relief because change always brings openings. Others felt exposed. If a figure as disciplined as he was could be removed, what shield remained for anyone else? Friends took stock. Enemies took credit by implication, never on paper. Families who had known him as a neighbor paid respects while avoiding the photographers waiting near the church. A quiet funeral, a small procession, and a city that had learned his name in headlines long after he had woven himself into its corners. Detectives built a timeline that reached back years. The setup required more than a single impulsive call. It required coordination. They mapped his recent meetings, ran down phone records, and pressed local sources who had lived near the edges of his circle. They asked who had been benched in recent months, who had returned from Los Angeles looking tense, who had said less than usual. The pattern that emerged pointed toward a decision made at a level where personal approval and organizational logic overlapped. He had regained status after years on the shelf, then lived under an invisible cloud as younger men questioned whether his prudence was a shield or a cover. At the same time, he had become invaluable to agents who could not otherwise see how San Diego's routine business connected to decisions in Los Angeles. Those two facts could not coexist forever. Jimmy Fratiano took the news hard and cold. He understood its meaning because he understood the code. If a man of that stature, careful to a fault, living at a pace that avoided noise, could be called to a phone and not walk away, then the room had decided that loyalty had a new definition. Jimmy weighed his options and made the choice that would change West Coast organized crime as much as any raid or sting. He went to the government and agreed to cooperate in full. He had already known agents from past brushes. Now he opened the door wider. He gave them names, roles, histories, and descriptions of meetings that clarified who had power and who carried out decisions. He spoke directly about the climate that led to the killing and about the belief inside the life that the Los Angeles family had sanctioned it. He helped prosecutors convert years of anonymous notes into a narrative the courts could use. Those prosecutions soon targeted the top. Racketeering charges tied extortion, loan sharking, and illegal gambling to a continuing enterprise. In those cases, the murder became a point on a larger map, a demonstration of internal discipline, and a count that showed the consequences of a breach. Trials in the late 1000, 970 seconds, and early 1000, 980 seconds laid bare the organization's structure. Testimony from insiders filled gaps left by surveillance. Transcripts captured the routine of tribute moving north, the splits that defined who got paid, and the way disputes on the coast rolled uphill when local talk could not settle them. The cases did not solve every crime or answer every mystery. They did confirm, in court, the system that Frank had helped run for decades. They also confirmed that his death grew from that system's decision to resolve suspicion with finality. San Diego's underworld did not vanish with him. It adjusted. Bookmaking still needed intermediaries. Loans still needed collectors. Bars still needed peace on busy nights. But the mood shifted. The old restraint he had enforced gave way for a time to louder plays. Younger figures tempted by Las Vegas money and by the quick returns of new rackets pushed into spaces he would have fenced off. Enforcement became less patient. Police saw more erratic bursts of trouble and fewer of the quiet conversations that had once prevented them. That turbulence gave law enforcement more openings. Cases grew out of mistakes made by men who thought speed could replace discipline. Looking back across his life, the record of crime is both specific and broad. He was arrested many times on suspicion of assault, extortion, conspiracy to collect debts by threat, and related offenses tied to bookmaking and shylocking. He was convicted on federal extortion charges that sent him to prison on more than one occasion. Those convictions were not whispers. They were delivered by juries and confirmed by judges. He served years. After release, he returned to the same core businesses: protection for illegal gambling, high-interest loans backed by intimidation, and control of coin-operated machine routes that gave him a reason to visit locations on a predictable cycle. He arranged for back rooms to host games, He brokered deals when independent bookmakers wanted to avoid trouble by paying for protection. He moved envelopes up the line to Los Angeles, taking his portion and ensuring others got theirs. He was also investigated in connection with violent episodes that followed disputes or defiance of the local tax. Police believed he had authorized or helped plan reprisals when necessary to keep fear in the system. He was suspected by some detectives in unsolved killings that marked the years of conflict between the Los Angeles family and rival crews around Southern California. Those suspicions were often driven by informants with shifting motives and by patterns that fit his role. He was never convicted of homicide. In that gap between suspicion and proof lived the uncertainty he cultivated. It protected him for decades, until a different standard internal certainty, rather than courtroom certainty, decided his fate. His methods were consistent. He avoided narcotics, which brought long sentences and national attention. He kept meetings short. He used the same kinds of locations over and over because familiarity helped him read trouble. He partnered with businesses that could pass for ordinary while hosting conversations at odd hours. Diners, bars with a side room, small offices where a man could sit with his back to a wall. He ran collectors who understood that a hint carries as much force as a shout when history supports it. He kept loan books in his head and in code. He limited travel and avoided fanfare. He cultivated a neighborly presence that allowed him to blend into a city that preferred to enjoy its weather without worrying about the hidden systems that shadowed it. Those choices had consequences beyond his own freedom. Borrowers lived with fear under interest rates that turned a small debt into a trap. Independent operators either paid or left town. Bar owners who took on quiet partners gave up a piece of income and autonomy in exchange for peace. The influence he managed stifled competition and channeled money toward a structure built to enrich a small circle. Families bore the weight in rent checks delayed, groceries skipped, and plans undone. That is the unromantic tally of the life he chose and perfected. He also lived the contradiction of helping law enforcement understand the very system he sustained. As a top echelon source, he passed along information that clarified active cases without naming every name in a way that would have ended him sooner. Agents valued his insight. He valued the protection and leverage that came with it. The arrangement likely delayed his end, but it could not erase the instincts of men who had built their lives on the belief that secrets kept them alive. When whispers along the coast compiled into a verdict, the organization treated him the way it treated any perceived threat, with a decision that left no doubt. In the late 1970 seconds, as federal cases tightened around Los Angeles leadership, court records drew a picture of a family under strain, a boss facing charges, lieutenants juggling pressure from Las Vegas connections and local needs, and a money stream that relied on steady, quiet earners. Frank had been the model of that role. By the time he died, his career also served as a warning. If a man so aligned with the old rules could be removed when suspicion crept in, then the rules themselves were changing or being applied with a sharper edge. That insight drove more men to cooperate and drove others to dig in. Either way, the institution he had helped to keep calm was forced into the open. In San Diego, the place where he had walked unhurried for so long, the investigation into his killing remained a fixture for years in cold case discussions. Detectives and agents compared notes and traded theories about who had made the call, who had stood in the lot, and who had given approval. Later testimony from insiders, especially from Fratiano, pointed toward a plan conceived and authorized in Los Angeles. The details of who held the weapon mattered less in the end than the decision behind it. It was a sanctioned act, carried out in a manner consistent with a culture that valued efficiency and deniability. The lack of a public resolution frustrated investigators but did not surprise them. The offenders had grown up inside a system designed to leave thin trails. Family and neighbors remembered him as courteous, reserved, and consistent. Those who had encountered him in business remembered something else. A presence that turned ordinary talk into obligation. A calm that signaled trouble without drama. Both pictures were true. He kept his household separate from his work, brought no loud arguments to the door, and made sure the rhythms of domestic life continued, even when the outside world pressed in. He went to the store, watered a small patch of grass, and walked at dusk. Those routines formed the cover beneath which he ran an economy that harmed people while keeping itself nearly invisible to those who did not want to look. His death closed a chapter in West Coast underworld history that began under Jack Dragna and extended through the shaky De Simone era into the steadier Licata years and the more embattled Brooklier period. He had adapted to each change without giving up the habits that defined him. He outlasted many, survived prison, maintained standing, and then, when the ground shifted under his feet for the last time, was removed by the same hand he had served. It was not dramatic, and it was not messy, because drama and mess were what he had spent his life avoiding. It was a decision delivered in a moment as ordinary as answering a ring. The years that followed confirmed the larger truth of his life. Organized crime in Southern California was never built on headlines and spectacle alone. It ran on careful men who made deals in low voices, who enforced lines with pressure rather than spectacle, who understood the value of keeping neighbors comfortable while keeping debtors uneasy. Frank Bompensiero embodied that model. His crimes, extortion, loan sharking, protection of illegal gambling, conspiracy to use threats, and participation in a structure that relied on fear are documented. So are his arrests, his federal convictions, and his time in prison. So is his role as a guide to the government's understanding of the system he ran. His end grew from that same system. The phone rang, the routine answered, and the life he had chosen closed on a street he had walked 1,000 times. In the days after, the street where it happened went back to small errands and familiar greetings. A city rarely pauses for long. Investigators did not. They worked the spiral of his last week, then the month before that, and then the long years that gave context to every step he took. They understood that a scene like that only made sense when seen against a lifetime of patterns. In that bigger map, they found the same elements over and over. Low-voiced meetings, strict schedules for collections, a border city whose businesses could be coaxed into quiet with the right kind of pressure, and a steady line between San Diego and Los Angeles that carried envelopes and instructions in both directions. News of his death changed the posture inside the life as much as it changed the mood at police headquarters. Men who had worked with him counted up old decisions and tested new ones. Jimmy Fratiano made the choice that turned whispers into testimony. He went to federal agents and, with the detail of someone who had been in the room, explained how the West Coast hierarchy worked, how money rose from small bars and back rooms to bosses who measured success by how little noise they made, and how a suspicion that someone had broken faith could turn into a sanctioned removal. He was blunt about the belief shared in his circle that the order came from the top of the Los Angeles organization. His cooperation, recorded and shaped into exhibits, helped prosecutors frame a set of racketeering cases that reached from quiet cafes to corner offices. Those cases described the world in which Frank had lived for half a century. The charges stitched together extortion, loan sharking, illegal gambling, and the use of threat to collect. They showed, in documents and on witness stands, how collections followed a timetable, how disputes were carried up the chain, and how men in San Diego checked with Los Angeles before they made a call that might ripple beyond a neighborhood. The murder that ended his life appeared in those cases as a piece of a larger pattern. It was not solved in the way that gives a detective closure, with a single defendant and a jury verdict pinned to a date. It did, however, take shape as an act approved by leadership according to testimony from insiders, who had no incentive to admire him and every reason to describe events as they had been taught to understand them. In court, and in the files that supported court, his own record stood stark. He had been arrested many times, often on suspicion tied to extortion, conspiracy to collect by intimidation, and protection of illegal gambling. He was convicted on federal extortion counts in the middle of his career, and again later, serving real time. Those convictions were built on evidence and carried out by judges who had seen this kind of case before. They form the backbone of what can be said with certainty. Around them lay the larger pattern. He ran Shylock money in San Diego. He protected bookmakers. He took cuts from coin machine routes and from the back rooms where cards were dealt, and he enforced order so that the income stream stayed smooth. That enforcement relied on fear more than spectacle. It pressed debtors, calmed bar owners in exchange for a percentage, and reminded independent operators that peace came with a price. He was also suspected in violent episodes that marked decades of friction on the coast. Detectives connected his name to reprisals and to unsolved killings, especially during the years when Los Angeles crews clashed with rivals, and when bookmakers who refused to pay tribute found their resolve tested. Those links came from informants, from patterns investigators trusted, and from context built over long surveillance. He was never convicted of homicide. That gap is part of why his name still travels with a certain chill in police histories. It reflects the same disciplined distance he used in every part of his work. Nothing written, nothing said twice, nothing that could be pulled into daylight without a witness brave enough to speak. A full accounting of his criminal life without drama, without myth, looks like this. He came of age during Prohibition and learned the value of carrying messages for people who did not want to be seen together. He graduated to protecting gambling and running collections. He watched San Diego grow and made sure his routes grew with it. Jukeboxes in corner bars, vending machines in coffee shops, and card games that needed a guarantee of calm. He supplied the guarantee, took his cut, and paid the people above him. He kept Shylock books, extended high-interest loans to regulars, and sent collectors when payments fell behind. He traded in small favors that added up: a warning before an inspection, a reminder to shut down a game early, a private conversation that ended a feud before it reached a sidewalk. He maintained relationships with other crews along the coast and kept one eye on Las Vegas without hitching his future to desert money he could not control. He refused narcotics because he believed drugs drew the kind of attention that ended careers. He preferred the old lanes: wagering, loans, machines, protection, because they had known rhythms and, if handled with care, allowed a person to walk through a grocery store without a camera crew in tow. With law enforcement, he played a long, limited game. He became a top echelon source and offered structure, who handled San Diego's books, which bars doubled as safe meeting spots, which couriers were trusted, and how messages moved when men on the coast needed a decision from Los Angeles. He shared information in a way that kept him alive. He confirmed lines of authority and clarified routines. He avoided colorful anecdotes, kept meetings short, and preferred public spaces where the background noise helped him control risk. Agents used what he gave to build the broad cases that Washington wanted. He used the relationship to buy time in a world where time was the most precious currency. It was not a bargain built on friendship. It was a matter of calculation. He would not have pretended otherwise. His household lived apart from this. Neighbors remembered a courteous man who walked after dinner, tended small tasks, and brought no commotion to his block. That ordinary surface was the point. It allowed him to meet people without drawing notice, to use payphones without looking out of place, and to remain, in a very public city, essentially unseen. It did not erase the harm. Families stuck in his loan books skipped rent to keep up with interest. Small businesses surrendered a share to ensure quiet. Independent bookmakers paid tribute to avoid rough lessons. Those costs do not make headlines, but they travel through households and linger for years. He built his life on that system and maintained it with an attention to detail that detectives admired even as they tried to undo it. The border shaped his world. Tijuana sat close, and traffic ran like a tide. He used that closeness the way cautious men use any useful fact, strategically and without noise. Meetings there offered distance from familiar patrol routes. Entertainment across the line drew people who might be more relaxed than they were at home. He did not treat the border as a wall, but as a feature of the map, one more way to smooth a problem if a face had grown too familiar in San Diego. The same care kept him clear of trades he considered reckless. He left heroin and cocaine to others and stuck to the traditional rackets that had fed his circle since long before his time. Within Los Angeles politics, he remained a man whose standing rose and fell with the seasons. He earned a place under Jack Dragna and kept the coast steady when turbulence rocked the city. He endured the DeSimone years, disliking the noise, and was shelved for stretches when his counsel ran against the grain. He came back with Nick Licata, whose calm approach suited him. He worked under Dominic Brooklier, whose tenure was defined by law enforcement pressure and by internal strain as younger men chased bigger, faster money. Through all of it, he treated San Diego like a trust, something to be guarded from outsiders and managed with rules that made sense to the people who had built it. That guardianship made him valuable. It also kept him visible to men who wanted to control what he controlled. As aging narrowed his options, he faced tests meant to gauge loyalty. His answer rarely changed. No narcotics, no flashy ventures, no hurried decisions that could turn into public messes. He refused assignments that clashed with those rules. In calmer years, that restraint would have been read as experience. In the mid-1970s, in a family under pressure, it was read as reluctance, and reluctance, in the worst light, could be mistaken for deceit. The men who judged him knew his habits as well as anyone could know them. They understood how to use those habits against him. A ringing phone at a familiar door was a perfect trap because he had built a life around answering those calls. The investigation into his death became a long-running thread that linked cases across the region. It influenced decisions far outside San Diego. Federal trials at the start of the 1,980 seconds laid out a record of how the Los Angeles family collected from the adult entertainment business, from bookmakers, and from businesses that needed protection, and how discipline was maintained when someone was judged to have become a liability. Those trials did not deliver a single, neat solution to his case. They did, however, confirm that his death was seen by insiders as a consequence of suspicion at the highest level. The man accused of ordering it, the boss at the time, faced federal racketeering convictions and died in custody years later. The killing remained officially unsolved in the narrow sense that no court stamped a verdict next to a specific name for that act. Unofficially, among those who knew the life, the conclusion settled early and never moved. His story continued to be told in books built from interviews and archives. Reporters and authors sifted court records, declassified files, and the testimony of men like Frasciano to reconstruct the quiet architecture of a city's underworld. They showed a San Diego that would be hard for a stranger to spot, a series of booths, counters, and front rooms where agreements were made and enforced without a voice raised. In those accounts he appears as he was, not a showman, not a politician, but a disciplined operator whose talent lay in keeping things moving without drawing spotlight. That talent made him essential to his peers and invaluable to investigators. It also made him vulnerable when a room full of men decided their comfort required his absence. Even now, the clearest way to understand what he did is to follow the money. Cash from small bets flowed to bookmakers, from bookmakers to layers, from layers to the people who allowed the system to function. Loan payments arrived on a timetable that did not care about a borrower's other bills. Coin machines were emptied on a schedule that kept routes regular and allowed for quiet check-ins. Envelopes traveled north, and a portion traveled back as a sign that San Diego had kept its promises. He sat at the center of that cycle, adjusting it when necessary, enforcing it when persuasion failed. He preferred persuasion. He understood that fear has more staying power when it is implied and not shouted. Nothing about this life was glamorous to him. He had chosen it early and accepted its rules. He wore plain clothes, kept a modest house, avoided big crowds, and refused to let work spill into domestic routines. The mask was not only a mask, it was a way of moving through the world that kept neighbors at ease. That same plainness sometimes led people to ask why he mattered, why his name surfaces whenever people describe organized crime on the West Coast. The answer is in the details. Decades spent protecting illegal income streams, multiple convictions tied to extortion, a leadership role in San Diego under successive bosses, a reputation that quieted rooms, and, at the end, a death carried out in a way that reflected the methodical culture he had served. The legacy of his choices still sits in the way agencies study hidden economies. Detectives point to him when they explain why patience matters and why simple routines, routes, booths, timetables, are often the best keys to a hard lock. Community members who lived with the consequences remember him differently. As one name in a chain of pressures that drained paychecks and altered plans, both views are true. He was a quiet neighbor, and a man whose work pulled money into a circle that kept itself strong by turning fear into compliance. He taught young associates to act like ghosts, and he taught federal agents, indirectly and directly, how to see those ghosts in daylight. In the end, the outline of his life holds steady. Born to immigrant parents, raised into caution, drawn into a line of work that rewarded patience, he became the San Diego figure others deferred to for decades. He committed crimes that left documents and prison terms. He was suspected in acts that left no verdict, but shaped how people spoke his name. He balanced cooperation with the government against loyalty to the only system he had ever known, and lasted longer than most, because he understood that survival depends on routine and restraint. The same routine handed his killers their opening. The same restraint gave law enforcement a way to write down what had been kept off paper for years. His story is the story of a city's hidden economy, and of the price paid by those who made it run. People who came later learned his story backward. They started at the phone on a mild night and traced the lines to everything that had come before. Old files and new books filled in the spaces between. Agents who had quietly filed reports about his meetings now spoke in more general terms about the ways organized crime functions when it wants to stay invisible. Prosecutors reviewed testimony that had been sealed, then unsealed, and saw how a man could be central to a city's hidden economy without ever asking for attention. In that telling, his earlier lessons showed up again. Keep your voice low, keep your circle small, and treat routine like shelter. Those habits had built his life. They also explained his end. In offices from Los Angeles to Washington, his status as a top echelon source became more than a notation. It turned into a case study. The Bureau had recruited him late in life because he sat near the nerve center of San Diego's rackets, and because he had the rare ability to describe a system without bragging or getting lost in gossip. He clarified who settled disputes, who carried envelopes north, and which businesses made the map work. After his death, supervisors pulled his file and underlined lessons about protecting a source when that source still moves inside the world he is describing. The risk had always been obvious. The result made it plain enough to those who needed reminding. At the same time, his involvement with the government added fuel inside the life to a belief that had been growing for months. Men who had once trusted his silence now treated every canceled meeting as a sign, every delay as a confession. That is how suspicion takes over. It turns habits into evidence and patience into guilt. Once the switch flips, argument no longer matters. The decision lands because it seems inevitable to those who have talked themselves into it. In that climate, the value he provided for decades' control without noise could not save him. Jimmy Frediano's turn toward full cooperation changed the scale of what could be proven. He knew where the lines ran because he had walked them with Frank for years. He taught grand juries how a quiet coastal city could deliver steady cash to the top of a family built in Los Angeles. He described meetings in back rooms, the role of coin machine routes, the way bookmakers layered risk, and the logic used when someone fell behind. He explained the political calendar within the organization, how leadership changes altered expectations, and why a man might be shelved even if his phone never stopped ringing. He put names to roles in a way that matched other records and helped prosecutors remove guesswork from their charts. Trials that followed in the late 1970 seconds and early 1980 seconds drew a map of the Los Angeles family's income and discipline. Racketeering statutes allowed prosecutors to show patterns instead of arguing single events in isolation. Extortion counts tied to adult businesses, illegal gambling, and protection rackets sat alongside conspiracy charges that reflected the ongoing character of the work. In those courtrooms, the portrait of San Diego that emerged matched what agents had been writing for years. Predictable routes, predictable meetings, predictable envelopes, and the constant hum of persuasion backed by the threat of consequences. The killing that ended his story appeared in testimony as an example of how internal judgments were enforced. Though not solved in the narrow sense of a single conviction for that act, it occupied a place in the narrative that insiders and investigators accepted, a sanctioned move by leadership convinced that a man had crossed a line that could not be crossed. The Los Angeles organization paid a price. A boss went to trial and to custody, where he died before seeing day-to-day freedom again. Others below him were convicted and served time that did not look like weekends. Leadership reformed around different faces, with Peter Milano eventually taking control and steering the family through an era when law enforcement pressure and changing markets narrowed the old lanes. The approach shifted in tone but kept the familiar goal. Collect without noise, avoid trades that invite heat, and rebuild earning power inside a region that had learned to see trouble earlier than before. San Diego remained important, even without the man who had held it steady for so long. New figures stepped into roles that looked similar on paper. The feel was not the same. Caution, the kind he had enforced as a creed, had to be relearned by people who had grown up with a different rhythm. His file, spread across binders and microfilm, offered more than names. It offered sequences. A bookmaker takes on too much weekend action and calls for help. A meeting is set at a diner with a side entrance. An older man takes a coffee he barely touches and outlines a payment plan that will keep the shop open. An envelope moves in a week, then another in a month. A collector checks in on Tuesdays, not Mondays, because Mondays draw attention. These were the loops he ran, hidden inside ordinary life. They made his crimes hard to see from the outside, and very real to the people who lived inside the ring. Loans at rates, No bank would consider stacked up. Families adjusted grocery lists to keep up. Bar owners gave up a slice to keep peace. None of it belonged in a movie. All of it lasted long enough to shape a city's habits. The documented pieces of his criminal record sit like posts in a fence line. He was arrested repeatedly on suspicion of extortion and conspiracy to collect through intimidation. He was convicted on federal extortion charges and sent to prison more than once. He served years, not days. He returned to the same rackets after release: bookmaking protection, shylocking, machine routes, and backroom games, and did so with the same discipline he had always shown. Investigators placed him at the center of disputes resolved without fanfare, and at the edge of episodes that left police convinced that consequences had been authorized from the top down. He was suspected by detectives in unsolved killings that punctuated periods of conflict within the Southern California underworld. Those suspicions did not turn into verdicts. They lived in files, and in the way people said his name. His instructions to younger men were simple and repeated for decades. Avoid narcotics. They warp judgment and bring harsh sentences. Avoid loud crowds. They attract cameras. Avoid written notes. Paper invites subpoenas. Keep conversations short. Let history do your talking. Those rules carried him farther than most. They also made it hard for prosecutors to fasten a case to him without the kind of testimony that arrived only near the end, when former allies turned into witnesses. He was never a showman. He was the person who made sure shows did not stop because of a fight in the hall. He sold continuity. It earned him respect from peers and attention from the people trying to shut the system down. Across the border, he found a second stage when he needed distance. Tijuana offered privacy without formalities. Meetings there were spaced out and careful, meant to avoid new problems rather than to birth new ventures. He did not stake himself to casinos or glitter. He used geography the way a chess player uses diagonals quietly, to open angles that were not obvious. Even that caution had limits. Borders do not protect a man if the decision against him comes from a room that weighs loyalty and fear more heavily than any other consideration. Writers who told his story after the fact treated him as a key to understanding how Southern California's underworld actually operated. They used interviews with investigators, trial transcripts, and informant reports to rebuild moments that had taken place in rooms where voices were kept low. They resisted the urge to paint him as larger than life because the point, with him, was the opposite. He only loomed if you knew how to focus your eyes. He appears in those pages as a principal in extortion schemes, a manager of high-interest loans, a protector of illegal wagering, a figure who carried clout in San Diego for the Los Angeles family, a man convicted and imprisoned for those crimes, and later a source who explained the same system to the government he had spent his life avoiding. The tension in that profile sits at the heart of how his name continues to carry weight. Police departments changed practices because of cases like his. They built long-term units that specialized in financial patterns rather than street arrests. They trusted toll records and wire orders authorized by courts to fill in gaps that surveillance alone could not bridge. They learned to read small routines: a car that parks nose in at the same time, a man who always chooses the booth near the kitchen door, a route that starts and ends with the same casual errand. Prosecutors leaned on racketeering law to frame what had once seemed like isolated counts as part of an ongoing enterprise. In memos and training sessions, his case surfaced as an example of patience and restraint qualities required of investigators as much as they were prized by the people being investigated. San Diego's neighborhoods, the ones he had worked for half a century, absorbed the shift. Some businesses went clean because the people who had enforced the old rules were gone or in custody. Others kept their cash economies alive under new management. The tone softened in places, hardened in others. The big difference was attention. Reporters and agents now saw the coast not as a sleepy sideline to larger cities, but as a region where subtlety had masked size. That clarity made it harder for the next generation to rebuild exactly what he had perfected. It did not make it impossible. Hidden economies adapt. He had been living proof of that fact for decades. For those who had known him only as a neighbor, the news never quite fit. The man they had watched carrying a sack of groceries, stopping to chat on a sidewalk, watering a strip of grass at dusk, belonged to them. The figure in stories about extortion and loan sharking belonged to another world entirely. Both were real. He kept his household apart from his work because that separation protected the people he cared about, and kept his own mind organized. That discipline did not change the moral ledger. It did, however, explain how he lasted. Compartmentalization is not a trick. It is a skill. He practiced it like a craft. Close associates, now older, remembered him as a man who believed that the best solution is the one no one else ever hears about. He preferred to settle accounts with words and presence. He approved heavier moves when he believed they protected the system that fed many families, including his own. He distrusted shortcuts and tried to teach others to distrust them. He valued schedules because schedules keep nerves calm and doors closed. Those same habits led him to pick up a phone on a quiet night because a ringing payphone had always been a tool, not a trap. The paradox in that detail explains his life, as well as any long list of events. In the official record, the certainty we are left with is clear. He committed felonies, extortion, conspiracy tied to intimidation, the protection and management of illegal gambling and loans, and he was convicted of some of them. He served time in federal custody. He returned to criminal work afterward and continued until the end of his life. He was suspected, credibly in some instances, of approving or planning violence connected to his role as an enforcer and organizer for the Los Angeles family in San Diego. Although homicide charges did not result in convictions, he became an informant late in life and provided information that helped build broader cases against the organization he served. He was killed in San Diego in 1,977 inches, an act widely understood by both law enforcement and insiders to have been authorized by leadership. These are the anchor points. Around those points lies the texture of a place and a time. The West Coast's underworld depended on the ability to turn ordinary rooms into sites where decisions were made. It required people who could keep accounts straight without writing them down, who could remember who owed what and how much of a cut belonged to whom. It needed enforcers who could remind debtors that a promise matters. It needed someone who could sit in San Diego and make sure the cash machine never shook. He filled that role longer than almost anyone else. He did harm that scattered across households and businesses. He also kept violence, when he could, below a threshold that would have brought civil panic. That is the duality of his influence. The years after his death did not produce a single document that made every mystery plain. They did, however, give a coherent story that matches what those closest to the events said under oath. Suspicion and internal politics collided with federal pressure, and the man who had made the coast safe for earnings was judged a risk. In response, the organization delivered a decision that fit its method: quick, controlled, without spectacle. San Diego exhaled and went back to its errands. Investigators filed the next set of reports. People who had learned to look away resumed looking away. And the phone, like so many tools in his life, stood as both instrument and symbol. What remains for anyone trying to understand him is the gap between surface and structure. On the surface, he was a neighbor with unhurried steps. In structure, he was a central beam in a network that took money from vice and fear and turned it into steady income for a set of men who valued order over flash. He chose that path early and never left it. He built a reputation that steadied others and unsettled adversaries. He cooperated with the government when he believed it served his survival. He died because people in his own circle decided survival now required his absence. That is the life in full, seen not through a myth but through the records that outlasted him in the city that, in small ways, still bears the imprint of his rules. Years after his walk stopped mid-step, the city that shaped him kept the same light on the water at dusk. People moved through the places he had favored without thinking about the choices made there. A diner booth where he once measured a debt now hosted birthday cakes and coffee refills. A small bar on a side street changed owners and paint, but still fought the same Friday noise with a calm that hinted at old habits. Those traces are how certain lives remain present. His name floated in conversations among detectives who trained the next class, among writers who read boxes of old files, and among former associates who had grown old telling the same cautionary stories with new wrinkles. They all returned to the same outline because that outline matches the record. He began in a house where Italian sat beside English, and where caution arrived as a family value. The move west put him in a city built for transit and opportunity, with a Navy base, a border, and neighborhoods where shop signs carried family names. Prohibition gave him a door. He learned to carry messages, watch shipments, deliver envelopes, and hold a steady face when risk entered the room. When national law changed, The habits he had learned didn't. He shifted to the rackets that defined his life: protection for illegal gambling, collection of high-interest loans, control of vending and jukebox routes that turned weekly rounds into a steady schedule of meetings, and quiet influence over back rooms where cards and dice made a second economy. Jack Dragna's Los Angeles organization recognized his value early. He was not a star, he was an anchor. He did not charm reporters or seek club booths where cameras waited. He favored locations where waitresses knew his name and where a chair put his back to a wall. He enforced the peace that let bookmakers work, kept machine routes orderly, and made sure tribute reached the city without hiccups. Arrests came. He took charges tied to extortion, conspiracy to collect by intimidation, and related offenses again and again. Jails and courts became familiar. Some cases collapsed when witnesses forgot, vanished, or simply lost nerve. At least 2 federal extortion prosecutions stuck. He served real time, kept quiet through it, and returned to the same work with even closer attention to routine. He never pretended the work was noble. He treated it as craft. Timing mattered. Tone mattered. He taught collectors to let history do half the talking. If a borrower knew the consequences from prior examples, a few words would carry the message. He handled Shylock money with a ledger in his head. He arranged for card rooms to run in peace, and for machines to be emptied on a schedule that kept routes predictable. He took his cut and sent the agreed share up the line. He warned operators when inspections were coming. He kept small favors in circulation because a network survives on those more than on grand gestures. Families paid for the network's calm. Debts that started small dragged on. Paychecks thinned under interest no bank would dream of charging. Competition disappeared in places where quiet partners expected a slice for keeping trouble away. The record also attaches his name to punishment. Detectives tracked him through periods when defiance brought quick reminders. He was suspected of authorizing or planning acts that forced stubborn debtors to see sense and that warned outsiders away. He was never convicted of homicide. Much of what is said on that front rests on informant statements, context, and patterns assembled by investigators who spent years in the field. It remains part of any honest account because it shadows so much else in his story. He built a life designed to keep his name out of indictments that would not fade. He largely succeeded until time and pressure altered the balance. Leadership shifts in Los Angeles often decided who worked with confidence and who worked under a cloud. Dragna kept faith with careful men. Frank DeSimone's years brought uncertainty and shelving. He sat out stretches in a formal sense while remaining the person San Diego operators trusted when disputes threatened to grow. Nick Licata's calm style suited him. Respect returned with that change. Dominic Brooklier stepped into an era defined by national pressure and internal strain. Through each chapter, San Diego remained a vital source of income that needed a steady hand. He provided it by sticking to the old rules. Avoid drugs, avoid spectacle, avoid sudden moves that make useful people panic. That discipline also drew the attention of the FBI, who learned that he could explain structure without reaching for dramatics. He began meeting agents with care, supplying a framework for how San Diego's network fit into the larger Los Angeles picture. He confirmed the flow of money and the hierarchy of responsibility. He named roles, not every person, and he kept the sessions short and controlled. Agents valued that restraint because it made other information make sense. He valued the contact because it offered leverage and, he hoped, a buffer against the unpredictable. The arrangement did not stop him from doing what he had always done. It did not redeem the harm he caused. It was a calculation, and he handled it like every other calculation in his life. Measured, scheduled, un adornet. By the middle of the 1,970 seconds, the street changed around him. Younger men favored fast plays and alliances that stretched into casino floors in Nevada, where outside interests exerted weight. He argued for the coast's old-style slow, steady, low. He insisted that narcotics were a trap. He turned down assignments that clashed with those rules. In a stable time, that stance would have read as wisdom. In a pressured time, it looked, to some, like concealment. Suspicion in that world does not need proof to feel complete. It converts habit into evidence. Meetings moved, questions repeated. and an invisible case formed in rooms where nods decide outcomes. The end arrived in a way that matched the life. Controlled. Spare. No spectacle. A phone rang near a small market. A call timed to intersect with a routine evening walk. He picked up. A figure stepped from the edge of a lot. The coast's most disciplined enforcer was removed in a moment, built on the predictability he had cultivated for decades. Police worked the scene and the history. Agents connected the decision to a leadership call in Los Angeles. No single conviction closed the file in the narrow sense. Later testimony from insiders, particularly from Jimmy Fratiano, who chose full cooperation after the killing, fixed the act within an organizational logic that both sides of the law understood without needing every signature. Fratiano's testimony pushed open doors that had been wedged for years. He mapped the flow from bar owners and bookmakers to the top. He explained how coin routes functioned as glue. He described how men like Frank stabilized a coastal economy that had never wanted a headline. Prosecutors used that clarity with racketeering statutes to argue that extortion, illegal gambling, loan sharking, and the use of fear were not isolated episodes but parts of a continuing enterprise. Trials brought convictions for leadership figures and reconfigured the family under a different face, Peter Milano, who navigated a leaner era. None of that brought him back. It did, however, confirm what the quiet city had hidden in plain sight for so long. The inventory of his crimes, as documented by courts and supported by investigative records, is blunt. He ran extortion schemes tied to protection of illegal gambling and to the collection of debts through intimidation. He managed Shylock funds that trapped borrowers under relentless interest. He controlled machine routes that doubled as a framework for meetings and leverage. He conspired with others to enforce order in a territory that paid up because paying felt safer than refusing. He was arrested many times and convicted in federal court more than once, serving years in custody. He refused to help grand juries that sought names. He returned to the same rackets after release and continued until the night the phone rang. He was suspected, often credibly in the eyes of those who worked his cases, of approving or arranging violence to support those schemes. Those suspicions did not become homicide verdicts. The paper says what the paper says: extortion convictions, prison terms, surveillance logs, describing a life lived in quiet rooms where money changed hands. He left a family that neighbors knew as private and steady. He kept work away from home. He drew lines and honored them in a way that made people on his block remember him as courteous, predictable, and present. That is part of the truth. The other part sits in the accounts of people who paid his collectors, who lost sleep over deadlines, and who watched their plans shrink under interest. His life blended those truths without apology. He believed order beat chaos. He sold order at a cost to people who could not negotiate the price. He ran San Diego for Los Angeles, with a steadiness that turned a sunny city into a reliable ledger entry. What came after proved how much of that steadiness had lived in him rather than in the air. Without his hand, San Diego's hidden economy wobbled, then adjusted. Some lanes went quiet. Others grew louder and drew quicker police response. The next generation learned caution the hard way, or failed to learn it at all. Law enforcement, enriched by lessons distilled from his file, built long-term projects that focused on money flow instead of roundups. Community awareness grew. Reporters did not dismiss the coast as an afterthought anymore. The map stayed the same. The way people looked at it changed. Time has a way of sanding edges off even the sharpest stories. His does not blunt easily because it depends on details that never fit the myth of glamour. He was a man in plain clothes who ran a city's under-the-table economy with patience and pressure. He sat in diners and decided how much fear to use to keep a system running. He avoided chaos because chaos invites sirens. He broke laws that carry the same names in every era and did time for some of them. He later described parts of that system to the same government he spent his life avoiding when he believed doing so would keep him ahead of danger. He died because the people he had served decided the balance of risk had moved. For those who want a lesson, the record offers a few. Routine is powerful until it becomes a cage. Silence protects until it becomes a target. A city can look calm while a second set of rules governs who gets paid and who gets pressed. Families feel the weight of crimes that rarely make the news. Detectives and agents succeed when they match patience with focus. People who live inside a closed world often mistake their own rules for protection that endures forever. It doesn't. The ocean kept breathing after the sirens stopped. A phone on a wall was replaced, then removed when time made it obsolete. The booths where he sat now hold couples who talk about ordinary plans. The stories that mattered most in his life now live mostly in paper boxes, in taped interviews, and in memories that grow shorter with each season. What endures is clear enough. He made San Diego work for a set of men who valued steadiness over spectacle. He collected money through fear and habit. He went to prison and came back to do it again. He helped the government see inside the room he had spent decades protecting. He was removed by a decision that fit the logic of that room. The rest is noise and hindsight. On warm evenings, the city still carries the same unhurried light he loved. People step out for a late walk, wave to someone watering a small patch of grass, and pass storefronts where phones once rang. Most will never know the old map that ran under their feet. A few remember and feel a familiar chill. He belonged to that map more than to any one address. He chose it early, mastered it, and paid its price at the end. In a place famous for sun and easy days, his life shows how much effort goes into keeping certain things unseen. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story from the Silent Empires. Frank Bompensiero here, thanking you for joining me on this quiet journey through loyalty, patience, and the passing of an era. If this story helped you relax or drift into sleep, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and join our family for more stories of gangsters and forgotten empires. Over 90% of our viewers watch but haven't subscribed yet, so if you enjoyed this story, your support truly helps us keep bringing these powerful tales to life. Share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories reach. Until next time, may the silence of the empire rest over you, and may the echoes of history carry you gently into sleep. Good night.